Now, I may not have been able to enjoy Power Rangers as a child, because whenever me and my brother watched it, we would end up fighting each other, and I guess destroying everything in our environment, so we were forbidden from watching it. But 2 decades later, I have been able to enjoy some form of Power Rangers, that being 2 Game Boy games that appear on my top 200, from 2 different Japanese developers. The first being Nutz at number 150 here, with Power Rangers Time Force, which is actually a sequel to Power Rangers Lightspeed Rescue, a game I played but didn't finish. I honestly couldn't tell you why I didn't, it's been too long at this point, but something about the design of the first one must have irritated me, and I would have to guess they fixed whatever my problem was for the sequel here. Notably, the games also have 2 different directors, but this is just a pretty basic but fun action platform game that shares staff with dudes who had experience developing action platform games on the NES, such as Toshikazu Iwasawa and Iku Mizutani, who is still composing music for games to this day. Gotta be one of the longest careers of a game composer, and speaking of which, the music in this game is very good. Certainly a thing that's gonna elevate any game on my list, since music is a top 3 thing I value the most, probably behind only gameplay and I suppose level design. If this was on NES, it'd probably be quite the popular game. It's even got wall jumping, and how many games you know on NES or Game Boy that can say that, besides Batman himself? This game even reminds me a bit of TMNT on NES, as you have 4 different Rangers that you can switch between. They do have the same attacks, but different stats such as health bar length, speed, power, and jump height, and when all 4 are dead, you game over. At one point, you even have to go through and rescue Rangers that have been captured. Notably, you only have a certain amount of time to complete each level, as the name of the game would suggest, although if this bothers you, you can always drop the game down to easy mode. It does have 3 different difficulties to choose from. It's not an amazing game, but it's all around serviceable, and the only parts I didn't care for were these mecha battles, I guess they're called Zords? But I would imagine this type of thing is a requirement if you are to make a Power Rangers game. Well, would you look at that, we have back-to-back Natsume titles. An Amazing Penguin here is, as the name would suggest, the most amazing penguin game on the Game Boy, which is actually no small feat. Game Boy has its fair share of penguin games. Amazing Penguin here is even competing with the likes of Pingu. Although Pentaro, the playable penguin from Antarctic Adventure, which does have a Game Boy version by the way in Konami GB Collection. I chose not to include collections on my list, maybe I should have mentioned that from the start, but anyway. You can play as Pentaro and Parodius, so if you do decide to count that as a penguin game, I'd have to crown that as number 1. But anyway, now to stop taking attention away from Amazing Penguin, because it really is an awesome and unique Natsume title, an action puzzle game, my favorite kind of puzzle game. And unlike a lot of puzzlers on Game Boy, this one doesn't overstay its welcome, as I felt it was pretty much the perfect length at 40 levels, and even more surprisingly, this game is not slow. Your penguin moves pretty fast, and you are racing against the time, so you actually can't afford to be slow, which keeps things engaging. The main reason I see this as a puzzle game is because, well, you're essentially in a maze, which yeah, this does make it the best maze game on Game Boy in my opinion, but you just go around and remove seals from passages to open panels, and once all the panels are open, you move on to the next room, with the password offered every 4 stages, so luckily, don't gotta finish this all in one sitting. And it definitely gives this pick up and play appeal which you want to see for the Game Boy. You also do have an offensive kick attack, so you're not completely vulnerable like you are in most puzzle games. And I guess the enemies are, which I finally now know because I've looked at the manual, are Eraser, Crayon, Metal Clip, Ice Skate, and Polar Bear. Well, you learn something new every day. Donkey Kong Country. Now I know this seems low for a game of this caliber, but hear me out. So Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo is actually one of my favorite games of all time, period, which means I'm gonna be a bit disappointed if another version doesn't get things right. It's for this reason that, for example, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe is completely absent from my top 200, despite being a huge fan of both Mario 1 and the Lost Levels. I just can't stand the differences in the Game Boy Color version, the most egregious thing being the screen size and lack of visibility, because the level and speed of the game were never originally designed with that in mind. And now you can play those games even on a Game & Watch, so the deluxe version is completely obsolete unless you for some reason like the red coin missions. I certainly didn't. But anyway, that's pretty much the same deal with Donkey Kong Country, because this game that I can normally beat in 2 hours on the Super Nintendo took 5 hours on the Game Boy Color, pretty much entirely due to the screen size and the levels not being designed around it. But this version's even lacking clarity, like with brown enemies over brown backgrounds that are pretty damn hard to see. In a way, its attempt at authenticity is its downfall for me, because even the Japan exclusive title, Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong, and Dixie Kong for the Game Boy Color, felt it was appropriate to turn the enemies blue, red, pink, and all sorts of colors to not clash with the backgrounds, and I enjoyed that game and the color job a whole lot more. Although I'll admit the backgrounds on Donkey Kong Country for Game Boy Color are impressive looking for the system. This version of DKC also became obsolete faster than Super Mario Bros. Deluxe by its Game Boy Advance version just a few years later too. Granted, Donkey Kong Country is a much more impressive game to bring to the system, seeing as it's a Super Nintendo title brought to an outdated, even at the time, 8-bit handheld. while the Game Boy Color is allegedly much more powerful than the NES, and I never doubted they could bring DKC to the Color, considering they had already proven themselves with the Donkey Kong Land trilogy on the original Game Boy, and I actually prefer these being original titles, especially the first game. I know that the second and third game are much more similar to their Super Nintendo counterparts though, but basically I would have much rather seen new original mainline entries to franchises like Donkey Kong and Mario, instead of ports of old titles. Big main releases is what the Game Boy Color needed in my opinion, but Nintendo for the most part wasn't interested in doing that. They just kinda rushed it out the door, and didn't intend to support it for too long. They were content with just putting out Gen 2 Pokemon, which was also playable on the original Game Boy anyway, as well as handing over development of the Zelda Oracle games to Capcom's flagship. So the only thing we really got for a brand new mainline Nintendo title was Wario Land 3, a game that I admittedly don't like, and isn't on my list, which does pay me to say when I know how much people do actually like that game. Donkey Kong Country does deserve credit for actually being on my list though, as Donkey Kong Land 2 is also absent, a game that tried to replicate the original, but completely fell flat in my opinion, being an even more frustrating experience than this title. And this game also deserves credit in my opinion, for having a superior aquatic ambience theme than Donkey Kong Land's version called Waterworld, though it's pretty close between the two. Some can't even tell the difference. They're composed by the same guy after all. Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion. Feels great to hear Alberto Jose Gonzalez's tunes again in this Bit Manager's title, and this is the first of the Turok games to appear on my list. There were 4 total on the Game Boy, but only 2 appear on my list, and spoilers, I'm just gonna be honest with you guys, they're the top-down games. The other 2 are side-scrollers, and while I think they have great soundtracks and graphics of course, not really a fan of how those ones play, due to giving the characters so many animation frames that they feel unresponsive to control. I mean, you'll probably be reminded of Prince of Persia when grabbing ledges and such. If they were more linear, straightforward action games, this wouldn't actually be that much of a deal breaker for me, but they also have maze-like stages which makes the games both frustrating and a snooze fest for me at least. Searching for the keys and pieces of the Chronospectre is even less fun when your character is unresponsive and you may just instantly die from fall damage by doing blind jumps and falls from not being able to see enough of what's below you. I definitely prefer if the challenge came more from fighting the dinosaurs than knowing what the heck it is I need to do in the level and where I need to go pretty much. Although Turok 2 Seeds of Evil is definitely less maze-like in its design and more action-oriented, I still have problems with the controls, and honestly, the gameplay variety it throws at you is just not executed very well. But anyway, I definitely think the top-down Turok games work best on the Game Boy Color, as they actually feel great to control, and are overall unique games for the platform, as there's not that many top-down running gun games for the system, especially with platforming elements. And the challenge in these games I do think primarily comes from the action on screen taking place. But I do think this one is less exciting than its sequel Rage Wars, which is why it's quite a bit lower. I actually played Rage Wars first, so when I first played this game, I was pretty confused about all the objectives that weren't really a thing in Rage Wars, which just had straightforward get to the end levels. While the gameplay feels pretty much identical to Rage Wars, it's the design of the levels I prefer a lot less here, as it's once again a lot of exploration, and going through winding maze-like levels, where you just need to find a key and figure out where it is you need to go, which does make the game not only slower paced than its sequel, but also feel pretty repetitive, because the game wants you to feel lost when going through identical feeling rooms. What also makes it slower paced are these vehicles you control, which the sequel decided to completely scrap, probably because they were aware that these aren't actually all that fun to operate. But for the action-oriented levels, this was quite enjoyable, and of course the music is excellent. Chalvo 55, or more likely Chalvo Go-Go. Now I actually talked about Chalvo in my Virtual Boy video, because he stars in the unreleased game Bound High, which was a pretty good puzzle platform game. Crazy enough, this is also a puzzle platform game, just using the normal expected perspective on Game Boy, and it's definitely slower paced and less arcadey than Bound High was. I mean, there's not even a high score here, which also makes it a longer title. Funny because I'm pretty sure every Game Boy counterpart of a Virtual Boy game is indeed longer despite being on caveman technology. The most unique thing about this game is that you transform between walking mode and bouncing mode, and you really gotta navigate these levels precisely in bouncing mode, as there's often spikes placed directly above or below you, which can be frustrating seeing as you die in just one hit. Walking mode is helpful just for pushing blocks and not instantly dying to spikes above you when you're trying to move, but no jumping allowed in this form. Enemies you'll also want to bounce on, just like in Bound High. So yeah, in Bound High you're really just playing as this dude's jumping form all the way through, from a top-down perspective. Turns out he has a whole other mode. Like I said, this game can get frustrating, which is why you'll really want to pay attention to your surroundings and plan ahead, so you don't instantly die when trying to advance through these levels, and unless you open up a map and pause the game to look around the level to do so. Even still, there's execution required, which I do think is nice for a puzzle game. That's part of why I like puzzle platformers specifically. Ideally, you want it to still be fun even after you know what to do. I finished it in a bit over 3 hours, so not a bad length at all. About the length I'd want from a puzzle platformer on Game Boy, honestly, unless it's Donkey Kong 94. That can say the length that it is. The transformations in this game do help to make it feel more distinct. If you get stuck at any point, you can also easily come back with the short passwords provided. If you've heard the music in Bound High, the music in this game is going to sound quite similar. While it is cool this character got to see the light of day after his Virtual Boy game got cancelled, it is a shame that this title never made its way outside of Japan, but it did eventually receive an English patch. I just can't remember why you'd ever need to read in this game. Nintendo World Cup. This is one of the rare sports games on my list, and I already talked about it in my Kunio Games on Game Boy video, but one thing I foolishly overlooked in that video is the Japanese version of the game because it is different. Something I didn't realize until I played the Kunio soccer games on the Famicom, and saw how different they are from Nintendo World Cup. The Famicom version features a different story with the tournament between high schools instead of a World Cup tournament, while having much shorter rounds at 2 minutes and 30 seconds versus Nintendo World Cup's 4-minute rounds. And the fields look different, which I mean, it's actually nice to have some variety in the graphics from time to time, though it would be the sequel that would add fields with different hazards and such. The Japanese version of this Game Boy game looks to be the same deal as its Famicom counterpart, with the main change being that they made it more like Nintendo World Cup, as Team Neketsu now faces off against national teams in a World Cup. But I think it's definitely worth mentioning those differences, because while I still have only played Nintendo World Cup, my biggest problem is that the matches drag. So it's actually possible the Japanese version with shorter matches would place slightly higher on my list if I bothered to play through it. Also, you can manipulate the game in such a way when you have a lead, where the opposing team won't show up on screen, and you can just wait out the timer, which is funny to pull off, but you'll have to be AFK for potentially a minute and 30 seconds longer in the Western release, which might not be ideal if you enjoy pressing buttons and things happening on the screen. But anyway, what I like about the Kunio sports games is that, well, they don't really intend to simulate sports. They're pretty much the OG Mario sports games, although I'll admit I like the Kunio sports titles more overall, I think. In this game you have 3 super shots, an overhead kick, diving header, and dribbling steps, and pulling these off is basically cheating, but you have to do it because if you don't, it'll be the computer cheating to win. But you can also just beat up the enemy team players until they can't move anymore. That's right, these Kunio sports games don't forget Kunio's beat 'em up origins, and that's why I think they're cooler than the Mario sports games, in addition to having that classic badass technos music. Mr. Nutz is my favorite Western-developed game starring a squirrel on the platform, which may come as a surprise to the very few Conker's Pocket Tale fans out there. Admittedly, I've only played the color version of the game, which is actually available only for color, and is almost twice the size of the Game Boy version. So for me, with such nice colors, why would I ever choose to play without them? My impression is that the original release, having been developed by Ocean, was noticeably more difficult though. You know, probably limited continues and all that stuff. What I can say for sure though, is that the box art for the original is interesting to say the least. Mr. Nutz doesn't do much to stand out from the crowd. You do in fact kill enemies by jumping on their heads. You are in fact a squirrel who shoots acorns, and oh, you have a tail whip attack. But this game is really only concerned with being pretty good and pretty fun. There is clearly plenty of care put into the 6 worlds that all feel distinct from one another, and even the boss fights are quite varied. You go from fighting a witch to an octopus to a giant to a clown, and to finally a yeti. That's right, the main antagonist of the squirrel game is a yeti, which, you know, why not? It's neat. This game's also pretty straightforward, and there's no forced collectibles that tends to kill Western developed platform games for me. So yeah, with all that in mind, and taking into account the nice graphics, it's hard to go wrong with this title. I really just wish the music was a bit better. It was done by Jonathan Dunn, but he was merely converting it based off the original Super Nintendo version, not composing himself, and I have to assume he probably didn't have much to work with there. Well, we have the first Nintendo-developed game to appear on my list, Solar Striker, which technically makes it the worst one on my list, which is pretty impressive for them, seeing as there were 56 games before this one. It was also co-developed by Minakuchi Engineering, also the first appearance for them. You might be aware if you watched my Mega Man on Game Boy video, they were responsible for some cool things later down the line. But also this is a shmup, which is pretty rare for Nintendo, although they do have some shmup origins, with Space Firebird, a game predating Donkey Kong, that I haven't played and don't pretend you have either. In fact, you might have just thought I was talking about an anime. But anyway, Solar Striker came out 10 whole years after Space Firebird, though it must have felt primitive at the time. This game came out in Japan the same month Airbuster hit the arcades, and you have to wonder if this was released on PC Engine, which was approaching its 3rd year on the Japanese market. Would anyone have noticed? Well, that doesn't matter because on Game Boy, it was sure as hell noticed. This was the first shmup released on the platform and had no competition. But seriously, most of the time you're just waiting for enemies to pop in on screen to shoot, because there was nothing else in the level design here that people in 1990 would have probably been expecting from a shmup. They probably couldn't figure out how to do all that at the time, without adding slowdown is my guess. Or if you compare it to Nemesis, which came out a month later, that plays quite choppy in comparison, while Solar Striker is smooth all the way through. And make no mistake, Solar Striker is indeed a fun game. You die in just one hit and there's no continues, so you will have to pay attention here. It's not the easiest game out there, but honestly, honestly, I think the difficulty felt quite appropriate for being the first shmup on the system before the Super Game Boy existed. Certainly not an unreasonable challenge and something you could beat back in the day on the actual handheld, under a light. It just varies in how engaging and challenging it actually is, although later levels do deliver decently for enemies on screen actually feeling threatening, partly because there's someone off screen firing quick shots at you that you can't destroy, while you're trying to deal with all these enemies. Seriously, who is firing these at us? There's also these mid-bosses you'll fight in the levels, which are pretty neat. The main boss fights feel the hardest when you first fight them, but you can figure out where on screen you can't get hit during these, and it actually becomes a cakewalk, which in a way makes the mid-bosses more difficult after a certain point. The power-ups aren't very interesting, they just make your bullets bigger or give you more bullets, and there were definitely way more interesting shmups to release on the platform in the following years, but for being the first of its kind on the platform, before developers could really utilize the console, it was as good as it needed to be. Battle Unit Zeoth, another shmup, one that isn't nearly as challenging as Solar Striker, as it's got infinite continues, and well, you don't die in one hit. Matter of fact, you've got this huge ass health bar at the bottom of the screen there. When shmups have these health bars though, they tend to get away with having a bit messier designs, but you can actually find no damage runs on YouTube, so just don't pay attention to the first result which says no death, but it's a guy playing with invincibility cheats on. But anyway, despite the overall low challenge, I do think the core gameplay is definitely more fun than what's in Solar Striker. You control a mech, and believe it or not, this is actually not based on an anime, but is actually a Jalico original. I suppose it's a bit like Burai Fighter Deluxe, which appeared earlier. You can shoot in multiple directions just like in that game, and you're controlling what looks like a guide, not a ship. However, this game is a bit faster paced, and lets you scroll the screen yourself, even during the auto-scroll sections. You can scroll it up and down, but there's also points where you control it entirely yourself, and this freedom really does make it feel like a one-of-a-kind game for the system. You can also walk on the ground, it's just really slow, so you're better off jumping. Getting power-ups is pretty satisfying, since you can upgrade to 4 big bullets. They feel like they take up half the screen, and make you feel like an unstoppable force. Or you can swap these bullets out for big ol' lasers. The music is really nice, and so are the graphics. The backgrounds are pretty detailed for a 1990 Game Boy release. The big bosses offer some nice spectacle, and it remains a smooth, fast-playing game all the way through. That was quite a bit of praise. I guess the main reason it's not higher is that, well, I beat it in 28 minutes on my first try, so it just doesn't stick with me as much as other games above it. TaleSpin, but I promise it's just a coincidence that there's 3 shmups in a row here. When it comes to Capcom's Disney games on Game Boy, they could range from being clearly worse than their NES counterparts to being pretty much as equal as possible, but only one of them managed to be clearly better than its NES counterpart in my eyes, and that would be TaleSpin, brought to the Game Boy by Duel. Some neat things about this game is that your plane can flip and fly upside down, also changing the direction of the scrolling. You can also fly your plane diagonally up or down, allowing you to shoot in those directions. Like Magical Chase, you can buy upgrades, and a connection this has with that game is that the composer for Magical Chase did the music for the Game Boy version. It's also like DuckTales 2 later down the line where you can buy continues or extra lives. Now, I wish I could articulate exactly why I enjoyed this Game Boy version more than its NES counterpart, but I can only make observations. The most obvious one being that it's actually a much shorter game. I found that the NES game was actually annoying at points, but the levels that annoyed me in that version are not even present here on Game Boy, such as the Haunted House level. Really, it just seems like I die or take damage from a bunch of things I don't see coming in the NES version. Yeah, cheap hits with everything being so fast you gotta know ahead of time what to expect, but everything's been redesigned here to account for the different screen size, and the game has been slowed down in general, which means everything is easily reactable. Also, I seem to not be the only one who noticed this, but the NES game felt unresponsive in its controls, particularly when flipping, which sometimes the game just wouldn't register, and I didn't have this problem on Game Boy. In the NES game, you also have a noticeable lack of firepower compared to other games in the genre, despite there potentially being a lot of enemies around you. While on Game Boy, your bullets are a much larger percentage of the screen size, and there's generally less enemies, so it's no longer an issue. Maybe it's just me, but the Game Boy version does feel like the better designed game. Of course, I'd love to hear your own thoughts in the comments on the matter. Do you prefer the game on NES or on Game Boy? Maybe it just comes down to which you played first, or which you're more used to. Also, I just listened to both soundtracks, and I feel like the NES soundtrack is surprisingly weak for a Disney Capcom title, and I think I prefer the Game Boy soundtrack. Turns out it was done by Hitoshi Sakimoto, who is also responsible for the soundtrack for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie, one of my absolute favorites on the system, as well as Bubble Ghost, and the music is one of the best things about that game. I was gonna say, you guys can let me know if I'm crazy for preferring the Game Boy music, but with this dude's track record, I feel a lot less crazy. Survival Kids is one of the most unique games on the system, as not even its sequel is all that similar, which involves surviving 100 days in a prison, which I found to be very tedious and not very fun. Survival Kids 1 though is all about exploration and survival on an island. You'll need to keep track of your hunger, thirst, and fatigue meters, by hunting, gathering, and resting. The game also notably features an item crafting system, and honestly you could definitely say this game was ahead of its time. It's kinda crazy to see something like this on the Game Boy, as it wasn't really until the 2010s that the survival genre became popular and mainstream. And while I tend to think survival games can be a pretty large commitment and time sink, Survival Kids, despite also being an RPG, I felt actually respected my time when it came to seeing the good ending. Something I can't say for its sequel, which was also just less fun in general. So if you want to see the bad endings in either game, it won't take you long at all. But yeah, that's the cool thing about this game. It's got 8 whole endings depending on the outcome of your time on the island. This game series had quite a few sequels on the DS and eventually Wii, but would go dormant after 2008. Until now, that is, in the big year 2025. Well, you're probably watching this in 2026 because this video is going to take a heck of a long time to finish. But anyway, I'm definitely going to have to pass on the new Survival Kids game for Switch 2, made by Unity Technologies. Good grief. Xenon 2. And I know what you might be thinking. What about Xenon 1? I don't know. But this is one of the few Western developed shmups on the platform, and not just this conversion, but its origin on the Atari ST. And I will say the most egregious thing about this game is that there is just one music track, which is true for all of its versions, not just this Game Boy one. It's certainly not a bad music track, but come on. Music is one of the most important aspects of shmups, because how are you supposed to care without banger tunes playing? And I did listen to the Amiga music, and I can definitely see how that was good enough to serve the entire game. But the Game Boy music is definitely worse, so it either needed someone capable of killer chiptunes, or more music tracks in my opinion. But anyway, onto the gameplay, and there's quite a few things that sets Xenon 2 apart from other shmups. For one, the player is actually in control of the scrolling, allowing you to go backwards except during boss fights. This is actually essential because you'll meet dead ends at points in these levels. I seem to recall a few times I've died for going the wrong way in shmups, and there was nothing I could have done except know ahead of time. Xenon 2, you'll notice, is actually pretty slow, but there's enough going on in these levels that it didn't really bother me. Really, this all just makes it a very fair game, even on your first playthrough, as you can react to basically everything. You'll also be moving through cramped areas in a slow tank-like ship though, so it is more difficult to dodge. Enemies drop tokens, and the game features a shop system where you can buy extra lives or upgrades that'll allow you to shoot different kinds of projectiles in different directions. It's pretty satisfying when you're fully decked out, as you start the game very weak. Even though I feel bad about putting it above shooters with 20 times the music tracks, as far as the actual gameplay, it's very solid and I don't have much to complain about. Star Sweep is your run-of-the-mill falling block puzzle game on the Game Boy, although this one released surprisingly late in 1997 and is based on an arcade game from the same year. But would you believe me if I said this is actually quite enjoyable? The game's got a 1-player mode, 2-player versus mode, story mode, and puzzle mode, so quite a bit of content, which you like to see. This was released only in Japan though, so you might not be able to fully follow the immaculate story of story mode. In this game you just need to clear blocks from the playing field by matching stars from the same colored blocks, and despite being on Game Boy, there's luckily no problem here when it comes to differentiating the colors. The Super Game Boy enhancements for this one disappointingly doesn't change the block colors, it just adds a border and green grass. The game's got 5 different difficulties, each allowing you to see the end, making it very accessible. But there's also room to be a tryhard on the Suyo Suyo difficulty. Look, I'm not going to pretend this game broke new ground, but I couldn't help but feel good playing this one. Thanks to the nice tunes and very nice presentation overall, and honestly I just like to see a quality Game Boy title from the year 1997. There aren't many at all. 63 titles deep, and would you believe it, we finally made it to motion control goodness with Kirby Tilt and Tumble. Now your experience with this one will differ greatly depending on what you choose to play it on, but I'll be honest, I finished the game on an emulator using a joystick to mimic the motion controls, and I was mildly annoyed at the time with how much I would accidentally jump. I was surprised though, when I played this on the real deal cartridge and Game Boy, that I found the real controls to be even more annoying. Tilting can move the screen away from your eyeballs, which can also move the screen away from a light source that you desperately need. You need to physically jerk the whole console for jumps, which can often misfire, and you'll probably be holding the system at weird angles for long periods, which is rather uncomfortable. So weirdly, the game whose entire gimmick is motion controls, I prefer with normal controls. But for those who do prefer the motion control aspect, it would seem as though the Game Boy Color version is the worst when it comes to this. As the one person to speedrun this game the intended way on an actual Game Boy Color is in dead last on the leaderboards. Above them are a bunch of people playing on the GameCube using the Game Boy player, tilting the entire GameCube to move curbs. I saw this technique for WarioWare Twisted, but was pretty surprised to see it also utilized for this game. But now the game is also on the Switch Online, and someone has climbed the leaderboards with the new gyro controls.
I was also surprised to see that, since I tried the gyro controls for a bit and wasn't a big fan. I mean, they made a motion control game where you can fall off the map every few seconds on certain levels because there's no rails around you. These levels are by far the hardest and most frustrating, and when you get back to having walls around you, it feels like a breather. People like to complain about those Mario Galaxy levels where you balance on a ball, but this game is like that for the entire game, and much harder to control. The game's also about not running out of time, and luckily there's a ton of clock tiles you can roll over to prevent that from happening. But anyway, that all might have sounded like I don't like the game, but despite any inevitable frustrations you'll have however you choose to control it, it is a fun time and it was made with care. The game's a good length and has a surprising amount of variety in its levels, way more than something like Yoshi Topsy-Turvy. And honestly, it does live up to being the only Kirby title on the Game Boy Color. A system Kirby seems made for visually, and the presentation absolutely does not disappoint. I think this is pretty easily one of the best looking games on the system. The colors really pop as much as you'd hope Kirby would on the Game Boy Color, which could have used more titles like this, new entries in Nintendo's major franchises. They truly showcased the hardware, with visuals that made it feel like a genuine step up from the original Game Boy. Not sure if motion controls were necessarily the right move, but I'll take what I can get. And well, this is the highest ranked Kirby spin-off on the list. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of a lot of gimmicky Kirby games, there are a ton, but this one I'm alright with. Interestingly, this also wasn't developed by HAL, but actually Nintendo themselves. R&D 2, that is. You know what was developed by HAL though? Trax. And this predates Kirby's Dream Land when it comes to being a really short and easy game for the Game Boy, making it one of the most inoffensive games on my top 200 I would think. No one seems to really hit on the retro games that are a good time but really dang easy, unless you're a huge tryhard I guess, but personally, I've only received comments telling me I'm not allowed to like a game that they personally found to be challenging. Now you might think that Kirby's Dream Land being easy was Sakurai's philosophy, but really, he only allows anyone to reach the end of his games, while putting in optional challenges for dedicated players who want to take it further. The optional challenge in Kirby's Dream Land being extra game. Okay wait, I just learned Sakurai is actually credited for Trax, responsible for animation and design specifications. Still, he wasn't a planner or director for the project, which is why it wasn't mentioned on his YouTube, but he did confirm that certain effects and visuals served as precursors to ideas in Kirby. But yeah, as for extra challenges, Trax has no such thing, which makes it the most chill shmup on the platform. That's what I've chosen to categorize this as, but you could probably label this as a run and gun or simply action game. I guess the main things that separates it from the shmups on this list is that you control a tank and there's no scrolling. You're the one moving from point A to B in a top-down perspective. But this game's structure is very similar to Kirby's Dream Land, both featuring only 4 real stages, followed by a boss rush of all the bosses you've already fought throughout the game, before you go against the final boss. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that they're made by the same developers and released only a year apart. But yeah, there are a few better ways to spend 20 chill minutes on the Game Boy than Trax. You could even argue it's more worth playing than Kirby's Dream Land thanks to its novelty factor. I can't think of any other game all that similar to Trax. Meanwhile, Kirby's got a lot of games that you probably struggle to keep up with, meaning you've most likely skipped plenty. But seeing as one of the games hasn't shown up yet on my list, you know which one I like more. I think I already said most of what I wanted to say about Puyo Puyo on the Game Boy and Color when I talked about Puyo Puyo Sun, but basically I feel that the Puyo series got better with each iteration on these handhelds. And the 4th game here, Pocket Puyo Puyon, is the only one that's playable only on the Color, and it shows. The presentation is a big upgrade from Sun, which had small chibified, mostly static sprites in the middle of the screen. Now the characters are large and detailed, and while they're really just transitioning between 2 different sprites just like in Sun, they at least feel more alive and expressive to me, making this easily one of the most charming puzzlers on the platform. This game was built using the engine of Sun, so it retains the speed of the game, as well as the Sun Puyo. While Sun offered 3 different character story modes acting as different difficulty settings, each story containing 3 to 5 levels, Pocket Puyo Puyon contains 9 levels with 17 stages, so it's easily my most played Puyo game on the handheld. And if I had to recommend only one, I'd have to go with this one, but both Game Boy Color games were good enough to include on my top 200. It's taken long enough for Sunsoft to finally show up, and they make their debut on this list with the game adaptation of the weird and iconic movie Gremlins 2. And their Game Boy adaptation is quite different from the NES version they released 2 months prior, since this one is not top-down but is instead your standard licensed side-scrolling action platformer. And it's a good one. It's got very nice tunes that mix playful energy with a dark edge. The first 2 level themes are entirely playful, which matches their relative ease. The game's only got 4 levels, which makes the game sound very short, and well, if you master the game it will be, but on the first playthrough if you're playing legit, expect to be playing levels 3 and 4 for hours. 50% of the reason this game's so hard is this boss right here, the Electric Gremlin, which is without a doubt one of the hardest bosses on Game Boy. Luckily when you get to him you do get a checkpoint, but if you game over, it's back to the beginning of the level. Gizmo's one attack is pretty pathetic and has next to no range. It's a pencil you collect in the levels, and without it you're completely defenseless. You're forced to get as close as possible to this guy who moves way faster than you do and unpredictably.
Truthfully, I couldn't find a way to avoid his attacks while still being able to get close enough to hit him myself, so it came down to just killing him before he could kill me. Level 4 is a bit easier, but still puts up a fight, and you'll have to play on point. The final boss is annoying in his own unique way, as his attacks are even more impossible to dodge, as you'll be at the mercy of this moving spiderweb you have to ride. This one really does come down to killing him before he can kill you. It's just a little bit easier to do so. But anyway, I thought Gremlins 2 was fun overall. The levels are well designed, though could use a bit more variety. It's mostly lots of springs, conveyor belts, spiky tiles, whacking gremlins with a pencil, and abusing the invincible toolbox whenever you can. If this game were a bit more balanced with more levels, I could see it being higher on my list, but as it stands, 86% of my total playtime was spent on the second half of the game, 2 of its 4 levels, which was by design. The boss fights are by far the hardest part about this game. Those pesky electric and spider gremlins, man. We haven't seen Sun L in 60 titles, but they're back on this list with a game that's unmistakably Sun L, Miracle Adventure Esparks. You might think that this is based on an anime like the previous 2 games on here, but no, this is based on a mascot for school supplies. How did you not guess that correctly? This included notebooks with manga panels you could read on the pages, and board games you could play that used erasers as dye. And this became such a hugely popular phenomenon among children that Esparks stationery was banned by the Parent-Teacher Association, forcing the 9th wave to be the final release after sales momentum dropped. Yeah, not at all surprising this would get banned. I'm only surprised it took so long since something like this would have been banned overnight at my school. But yeah, this game's pretty good, with great tunes, graphics, and fun gameplay. He's got fun abilities, mostly projectiles you can upgrade and switch between, and he can even ride a dragon which plays pretty awkwardly to be honest. Even for Sun L standards, the player and their hitbox are enormous. So good luck dodging things, and once again they seem to have forgotten they're developing for the Game Boy here. You'll have such little visibility when jumping up or dropping to different heights. You're guaranteed to get hit by things that are unreactable. They seem to design their Super Nintendo games in the exact same way, as far as the familiar style of level design, with player-driven scrolling. Given how much more room you can see here, this is probably fine, but on Game Boy I really think their games could have benefited from a tile-driven camera. If not, then sacrificing a large player sprite with something a bit smaller to allow for more room to see and act, in addition to more thoughtful enemy placements. It can feel like this game doesn't really care when it comes to that. It knows you're going to take damage from blind jumps from enemies not in your view until it's too late. And to be honest, I don't care that much either. That's why the game's this high up, and that just comes down to the pretty low difficulty. Basically, you're probably going to be only slightly frustrated, instead of throwing your Game Boy and punching holes in the wall because of the forgiving nature of the game. I mean, I was able to clear it in under an hour on my first playthrough, and it seems Sun L kinda learned their lesson after this. This was their first platformer on the system, and all their platformers after this have much smaller player sprites. But despite this, I thought Miracle Adventure Esparks was still overall more fun and less frustrating than the Sun L games it's above, which still retained annoyances with the level design and player tracking, while being much more challenging games. Esparks here is obviously for children, after all. Masakari Densetsu Kintarou Action-Hen. Oh, we're really getting into the good games now. Okay, we've actually had plenty, but for some reason that was just my reaction when seeing this game on here. So I guess it left a real good lasting impression. This is perhaps the most Japanese game in the entire library, based on the legendary folk hero Kintarou. There's only one other guy on the platform, that we may see later, who gives him a run for his money when it comes to most Japanese games. Now this isn't the most thoughtfully designed game in the world or anything, with these interesting slopes, and some bullshit enemy placements, but I do like to swing for my axe, and ride my caped flying bear friend. But seriously, there is a ton of variety to be found in this game from start to finish, and it's a decent length. When it comes to level locations, enemies, and various bosses, there's so much to see here because, well, I guess it's trying to tell its tale accurately. You'll befriend many animals along the way, and do a lot of sumo wrestling, which I could personally go without, but you know, if it's a requirement, it's a requirement. Nemesis. Now don't let the name fool you, this is actually a Gradius game, and it was Konami's first shmup on the platform, releasing only a month after Solar Striker, and the gameplay is quite a bit deeper than that title if you can believe it or not. You know, it's only Gradius, father of the quote-unquote modern horizontal shmup, which gave players great control over their weaponry, had more complex level design, and most importantly is the first shmup to feature Moai. Now Konami's first Game Boy efforts for its major franchises were pretty rough. TMNT was slow and simple, Castlevania was excruciatingly slow, and had a plethora of other problems, that's why you're not going to see it on this list. Nemesis is an acceptable speed, but there is noticeable choppiness to the game, which is unfortunate. Just like TMNT and Castlevania, they seem to rush this onto the platform before they really had a grasp of the hardware. We could have gotten a better product had they waited a bit longer. While the Konami GB collections do improve Castlevania the Adventure's speed, they do not fix this game's choppiness, which to be honest, is probably because the game is already fine how it is, and is not nearly as frustratingly difficult as Castlevania the Adventure, because you can just set your lives to 99, which is quite a bit different than NES's Gradius, where you have no such such option, and if you game over, you're donezo, pal. The game also has a stage select if you want to practice, and an auto shot feature, so yeah. Konami actually understood they were developing a game for a brick with a green screen you can barely see. You love to see it. But yeah, all of this game's problems may or may not have been addressed in its sequel released a year later, and this game may or may not have been surpassed by every single shmup Konami released on the platform afterward. I mean, in the same year we got Twin Bee 8 months later, which has no choppiness or slowdown, and honestly just plays perfectly, which is partially because Konami became more experienced with developing on the platform, but also because Twin Bee doesn't render tile-based level geometry, but instead has only bells, bullets, and enemies. This game might have fared a bit better as Konami's first shmup on the platform, but well, you do gotta start somewhere, and Nemesis was a perfectly acceptable stepping stone. Looks like we've got back-to-back Konami, and they brought us a ninja game. As you know, Konami may know a thing or two about making kick-ass licensed ninja games, and if you do want to know more, you can always check out my top 10 ninja games on Game Boy video. This one just so happens to be a superhero I know nothing about, and this is quite different than their NES version of the game, which released at the same time, as this one sticks to being a straightforward side-scrolling action platformer all the way through. This guy can slide, kick, and wields a staff thing, I don't know how else to describe it, that you can swing and charge to shoot out fireballs. This guy's goal is to save the Earth from becoming a toxic wasteland by battling Lord Contaminus and his various mutant thugs that were created by toxic waste. I definitely prefer the NES version over this game for its tunes, variety, speed, and overall game feel, but you can't go wrong with either. The main problem I have with this Game Boy version, I keep calling it a version but they're entirely different games actually, is that it suffers from a lot of slowdown, and Zen himself is already not very fast, but it's recommendable to anyone because this game isn't difficult. Some might even consider the difficulty level to be perfect, and the game's levels are really thoughtfully designed. Really just wish the game played faster because if it did, it'd definitely be a bit higher. Final Fantasy Legend 2 is frequently cited as the best of the trilogy, but if it weren't for the internet, I would definitely not be able to guess that that's the case. And for those who don't know, these are not real Final Fantasy games, they were just called that in the West for marketing purposes, but this is actually a part of the Saga series, which later did directly influence Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest, but personally I like the Final Fantasy Legend more than this, just for how broken the game is, and I also prefer Final Fantasy Legend 3 for the polish, while Final Fantasy Legend 2 sits somewhere in the middle, which I'm sure is one of the reasons why it's cited as the best, since people probably think the first game is too archaic, and the third game too traditional. And another reason I'm told people really like this game is for the story. But I'm gonna be honest guys, if you put a gun to my head and ask me if I can remember the story of any of these games in the Saga trilogy on Game Boy, well, I'd be dead basically. I did pretty much marathon all three of these games back to back, so maybe that hurt this game's memorability for me. And I know I won't be able to convince you that this game is somehow worse than the other two, but that's not really the point of this video. I'm just being honest with how much I enjoyed these games and ranking them accordingly. There is much to like about this game, like the legendary soundtrack brought to you by Nobuo Uematsu and Kenji Ito, and this game introduced the robot race, which is pretty cool. This must have been the first Game Boy RPG to feature robots. Unfortunately, the Game Boy robot RPGs would start to get out of hand later down the line, especially on the color. Seriously, I could not tell you how many exist on the platform, especially with all the Pokemon wannabes. Bonk's Adventure. Now I gotta be honest, I struggle to understand how Bonk, or PC Genjin, could be the platformer mascot of the PC Engine, but I think I've realized the reason for that is my experience with Bonk is limited to the NES and Game Boy, which don't provide the most authentic of experiences, especially the Game Boy games, which are really slow and of course, don't provide you the best visibility. Based on the footage I've watched, I still need to play the original games, but basically Bonk is more like Sonic the Hedgehog or something than a slow caveman in his original games, able to stay airborne indefinitely with the help of the TurboGrafx turbo button or switch depending on the controller. That's not possible here on Game Boy, not just because you don't have the turbo button, but the level design also doesn't allow for it. In the original games, it seems like you'll always have a flower, cloud, or enemy to land on and maintain your momentum, but on Game Boy, this really does play like a typical slow-paced platformer, still made interesting with Bonk's mechanics and power-ups, and the game just looks really nice as well. But yeah, I talked about in my top 10 caveman games on Game Boy video that I didn't really understand Bonk's appeal that much, but I think I'm gonna shut up about it since my experience is limited to his games on the 8-bit Nintendo consoles. But I've been playing a lot of PC Engine lately, so it's only a matter of time until I get a taste of the real deal, and I'm looking forward to it. Donkey Kong Land is the most interesting of the land and country games on the Game Boy, and it's the only one that actually tries to do something new. Donkey Kong Land is an entirely original game, besides, well, having the same characters and I guess mechanics as Donkey Kong Country, but the levels and settings are completely changed. One of the first levels you play on is a snowy area, and one of the first enemies you encounter is Hogwash the Flying Pig. Yeah, you didn't see him in Country now, did you? And that's what I love about this game, and I'm sad the follow-up games only tried to mimic the Super Nintendo originals. A lot of the tunes are entirely new and they're damn good. Can you believe it? That David Wise managed to make good music? There's also music by Norgate, the other credited composer, and you'll probably be able to differentiate between the two composers. That doesn't mean Norgate's tracks are bad, but they really don't sound like something David Wise would compose. And they don't sound much like Donkey Kong either, but I'm sure no one at Rare cared all that much, because it's just a silly Game Boy game. I mean, I think Nintendo felt the same way about developing Mario and Zelda on the platform. That's why those games are quite weird for the series, and that's why this game will have Donkey Kong platforming through cities and on top of clouds with weird hearts in the background. I mean, what am I even looking at here? But I do think the game's originality is also its downfall. Like this level where you're just waiting on top of a moving platform and changing its direction. Not very fun, I have to say. And as the first game in the series on Game Boy, as you might expect, this one is a bit lacking in polish, with jankier hit detection, and I seem to recall there were times where I just slipped through the ground and died. Movement is all around stiffer and slower. You'll probably encounter some common Game Boy design flaws as well, with blind jumps and impossible to react to enemy ambushes. Also, you gotta collect all 4 Kong letters in a level to save the game, which I'm not sure I like too much for a pick up and play Game Boy game, but oh well. Well, I definitely have problems with this game. The next DK game is over 100 spots above it on this list, but I'd be very interested to know why they give up on originality for the DK Land Game Boy games. I don't know if they just stopped caring or what, but we also saw something similar with the first Battletoads game being entirely original, while Battletoads and Double Dragon and Battletoads in Ragnarok World followed the original titles. Batman Return of the Joker is a game that seems to get a bit of a bad rap, even though most people tell you Sunsoft were great at developing 8-bit Batman titles. And this game's staff is no joke, as this game shares the same director as Looney Tunes, another great Game Boy title, and is even composed by Minami Matsumai, who was the composer of the original Mega Man and worked on Mega Man 2 primarily as a sound programmer, also helping with a few of that game's tracks. She references Mega Man 2's stage select theme in this game's stage select theme, probably because, just like Mega Man, you can pick the stages in any order, and this has led to a lot of plagiarism accusations, which is funny because they were done by the same person. But anyway, the main reason this game tends to be viewed unfavorably is because of its difficulty, setting hazards like rising sewer water, as well as frustrating controls, as your grappling hook is activated by pressing up, which can be done accidentally. And yeah, to be honest, the grappling hook complaint is pretty valid, but it's still fun to swing through the levels when you pull it off correctly. Another ability given to Batman to make him even more fun, in addition to his wall jump. That's right, his wall jump from the NES game is back here, and I think it's kinda interesting how the first Batman on NES was an action platformer with an emphasis on wall jumping puzzles, while the second game, Return of the Joker, was a run and gun. Because on Game Boy that's been reversed, as the first game was a run and gun, while this game is an action platformer with wall jumping. But anyway, I found that selecting easy mode got rid of most of the annoying hazards in the levels, like the rising sewer water, and it even removes the annoying magnet on the final boss. So if you ever find yourself pissed off by this game, just play on easy mode. There's no shame in it, it's in the game for a reason. This game's got great tunes, graphics, Batman is fun to play as, and there's solid level variety for better or for worse. It is a short and sweet game, so if you do ever find yourself wanting more, you can always ramp up the difficulty for some extra pain and extra playtime. Bonk's Revenge. Yeah, this is pretty much the same deal as Rayman being very slightly above Rayman 2, although I guess this time I like the sequel more. But yeah, this is quite a bit different than the next Batman title being like 75 spots higher, and the next DK title being over 100 spots higher. Bonk's Revenge is longer than the original game, and there's more interesting variety in this one. I mean, Bonk rides a train and even goes to outer space this time around. The power-ups are chosen randomly after eating meat, and they're a bit weird. Bonk can turn into, I guess, a superhero, prisoner, and hungry fella. The game looks a bit better, although I think I prefer how Bonk looks in the first game, and it plays faster as well. Unlike the first game where you can have the speed power up for only a limited amount of time, you get to keep the Master Bonk power up here, which allows you to move faster. That is, until you get hit and lose it. But even Bonk's base speed in this game feels faster to me, though that might just be my imagination. But yeah, with all those things in mind, it's enough for me to put this game very slightly higher than the first. In case you forgot by now, I did allude to there being 2 Bomberman games on my list when I talked about Pocket Bomberman much earlier, and I said that one is not like your typical Bomberman game. And yeah, I honestly would never recognize this as a Bomberman game, if not for the internet. In Japan, this is known as Bomber King Scenario 2, which is a sequel to Bomber King, which is called Robo Warrior in the West, an NES game ICOM developed with Hudson. ICOM is frequently cited as the developer of this game, but I'm pretty sure they're only mentioned on the box because they created the original game, while this was reprogrammed by Sunsoft, seeing as all the staff also worked on Sunsoft titles. But I'm not going to look too deep into this one because it'll probably give me a headache, and I could be wrong by crediting Sunsoft here because pretty much every website credits ICOM. But anyway, clearly Sunsoft was involved, as they did publish the game, and their employees are directly credited for developing it, which means they had the opportunity to market this as a Blaster Master game, because apparently and it's hard to believe, Blaster Master was way more popular than Bomberman in the West at that point, and this tracks when you realize Wario had to be added to Bomberman's first Game Boy game to even get it to sell, when Wario didn't exist in the Japanese version. This is especially crazy when you remember, Nintendo almost never lends its characters to other developers, but they must have seen it as very important to this game's success. Okay, so big correction here because I literally forgot this game existed, but Wario Blast was not Bomberman's first Game Boy game. That was actually Bomber Boy in Japan, aka Dino Blaster in Europe and Atomic Punk in North America. And Bomberman World the arcade game was called Atomic Punk 2 in North America, and New Dino Blaster Global Quest in Europe, so yeah, back then they had zero faith in this now iconic character selling outside of Japan, after going with its original title Bomberman for the NES version. I mean, this is like if Capcom repeatedly changed Mega Man's name or something, due to Mega Man 1 not selling great when it came out. They also had the opportunity to call this game Robo Warrior 2, but I guess the first game was too much of a flop for that. But this game does look like Blaster Master's top-down sections, and the boss fights feel even more familiar. So yeah, this is technically both a Blaster Master and Bomberman game, which is kind of funny because neither of those series had their traditional games on my list. I just wasn't a big fan of them, to be perfectly honest. But this game, right up my alley. This game uses a similar formula to the first Bomberman game, which is blow shit up and try to find the exit, although in this one you'll also need to find a key. And given all this guy's extra abilities and items he can pick up, I mean, you could even argue this game is a bit of a run and gun game, seeing as he can actually shoot things. I find this game to be way less repetitive than your typical Bomberman game, and it helps that it doesn't drag on too long. You'll hear pretty much the same 3 music tracks during the actual game. Despite the very limited soundtrack, this didn't bother me because the main music track originally composed over at Hudson for Robo Warrior aka Bomber King has been made even better because, well, it's Sunsoft. Do I really need to say anything else? I only really found one thing irritating in this game, which is the dark portions. The final level in this game is a dark level, and it's blatantly harder than anything else in the game, and not in a fun and challenging way, more like in a stupid and annoying way. Considering you can't see enemies, walls, spikes below you, or whatever it is exploding in your face, so this just comes down to trial and error, and using your limited lantern items as efficiently as possible. Definitely an unfortunate way to end the game, but up until then, it's quite swell. Noobow is my favorite video game based on a discontinued chocolate mascot with multiple anime adaptations, brought to you by Morinaga, the same creators as the legendary Kyoto-chan. This game, though, was developed by IREM, and that name by itself is probably enough to tell you that this game is no joke. This may be the least rage-inducing game on my list. That's not to say it's the easiest, because as you can see it's a puzzle game, which means you may have to use a little bit of brain power, but I would genuinely be shocked if anyone in the history of mankind managed to rage at this one. This game's all about picking up items and using them at the right locations, like giving an acorn to a squirrel. Who would have thought? You can pick up one item at a time, and because this dude is super slow, always walking at his own pace, the solution tends to be a screen or two away. Where this game really shines is the presentation and variety. The cutscenes are charming, sprites are huge and expressive, Noobow is cute and bouncy when he does something as simple as walking up and down steps, and in this game you'll never know what to expect next. When it comes to settings and I guess the NPCs you encounter, who, if you help, will help you in return. Like, did I expect I was going to encounter Santa Claus playing this? Well, I should have. It did come out in December. Quite a wholesome game. Kind of what you'd hope for a game based on a funny looking chocolate mascot. M&M video games? They can't compete with this. No, seriously. I despise M&M's Mini Madness for the Game Boy Color. Perhaps a little controversial to admit publicly, but oh well. Magical Taruruuto-kun, another game based on an OG Shonen Jump series, and I gotta put out a disclaimer right off the bat, the frame rate of the game is much higher than what you're seeing here. I was just recording on my lousy laptop when I was away from my regular equipment. Anyway, I think this game is pretty neat, and I say this as someone who has not watched this series at all, and knows nothing about it. You primarily play as Honmaru, who has the abilities of jumping and punching. Pretty insane, I know, and you'll be able to punch most things, even boulders that fall at you from above. He controls nicely, and you can reliably avoid the obstacles this game throws at you, which are both reactable and predictable, so honestly, I did feel that it's a well-designed game with a nice flow to it, as you dodge and reposition around enemies and obstacles, while punching anything that comes near. It does feel like you can get through the game as just Honmaru, but you actually have a whole other character at your disposal, Taruruuto-kun himself, who you can command to do pretty damn useful things, like clearing enemies or obstacles for you, or providing you with a bow and arrow to use. There's also many games you play in the game that I guess level up Taruruuto-kun's abilities, but yeah, I don't remember how this works. This game's only got 4 stages, but I felt that the game was at a suitable difficulty level that allowed it to take some effort and not be too short and disappointing. No, this is not nearly as hard as the 4 levels in Gremlins 2 or Batman Return of the Joker, in case you were wondering. There's also a sequel that I couldn't get into at all, which was made by a different developer, and I seem to not be alone on that considering the first game has way more speedrunners than its sequel, and has people reminiscing about its awesome soundtrack, while the sequel hurts my ears to listen to, and if we're being honest, this killed the Taruruuto-kun video game franchise, seeing as it was the last game for it. Ultraman Ball. This has got to be one of the most accurately titled Game Boy games, and you'll never believe what you do in it. You play as Ultraman, who can turn into a ball. There were quite a few Ultraman games on Game Boy, which range from being generic to fatally stupid. This here though is actually one of the most unique playing platformers on Game Boy, and you don't have to be an Ultraman fan to enjoy it. The design and abilities are enough to carry the experience. You have a sort of wall jump climb, you can fly for a limited period of time, but most importantly, you can seamlessly transition into your ball form to kill enemies, get past spikes, and destroy blocks to progress further. This game is lacking the badassery you might expect from Ultraman though, which is not present in its soundtrack or gameplay, but this really just ends up being a fun and chill Game Boy game that feels pretty impossible to hate. You do die in just one hit, which can be mildly annoying, but the game has unlimited continues, and it's a relatively short game, taking me just under 40 minutes to see the end on my first try, so pretty recommendable to just about anyone, and honestly had me wishing there were more games like it. Ball platforming games, or whatever you want to call them, or even just Ultraman Ball games, but apparently, this is a relicensed sequel to an Armadillo game on Famicom that I somehow never knew about until now, and will definitely need to check out. Skate or Die Bad and Rad. Not a bad title at all, because you will die a lot in this game, and also skate. No really, this game is really hard, but at least there's unlimited continues, and even a level select for any of the first 4 stages. The game also plays well, unlike something like Castlevania The Adventure, so it feels a whole lot less evil, but there's also very blatant trial and error design, so you'll need to die to learn to get a little bit farther, just so you can die to learn again. But yeah, this game is not for everyone, and it makes you wonder why Konami wanted to make this for Game Boy instead of for the NES or something. This game doesn't even have passwords or anything, and was before the Super Game Boy existed. It's one of those blasphemously hard early Game Boy platformers that makes you wonder what were they thinking, but I still gotta respect it because there's quality to be found. But I can't help but think that maybe a standard EA developed Skate or Die sports game would have been a better fit for the platform, or maybe not because Skate or Die Tour de Thrash is not on my list, and to be honest, I didn't even know this game existed. But yeah, Skate or Die Bad and Rad is the only game in the series that's a Konami original, and it's the only one that's a 2D platformer. Although there's also top-down sections for added variety, which I'm not a big fan of these levels. They really do not give you much room to see ahead of you. But the 2D platformer levels have a satisfying kind of rhythm to them. It's all about timing, since you're skateboarding and can't just stop on a dime. You're always carrying momentum, and just the fact that this is a skateboarding platformer game gives it some novelty. Nothing else on Game Boy plays quite like it. It also helps that this game has great tunes from Konami's best Game Boy composer, Hidehiro Funuichi, who I can't believe I've never mentioned in one of my videos before, since his music elevates every game he touches. Though it's not always enough to carry the experience, otherwise you would see Castlevania The Adventure on my list. Motocross Maniacs. 2 back-to-back Konami sports games, what are the odds of that? Only this one is not skateboards, but is in fact motorbikes. Seeing as this was an early release in the console's library, 1989 for Japan, it's like the Excite Bike of the library, only it wasn't used to later develop Super Mario Bros., aka the most important video game ever made. But I personally think this game is a whole lot cooler and more fun than Excite Bike, especially if you take the time to get the hang of things. This game is even more timing and momentum based than Skate or Die Bad and Rad, especially seeing as there's no way to die. Your only enemy is the timer. It's essentially a racing platformer game, and it's very satisfying to clear levels in time, especially the later stages, using your limited fuel as efficiently as possible while trying to land properly and not fall off your bike in the process and lose momentum. There's also power-ups, and I don't even remember exactly what they all do. Why is there a mini biker guy following me here? There's only 8 stages, but you can't really expect a 1989 Game Boy release to have that much content. But this is proof that Konami was able to release a Game Boy game in 1989 that was fast and smooth playing, so long as they simplify the graphics. Castlevania The Adventure, which released just a month later, demonstrates the downsides of having first-year Game Boy visual ambitions. Would have been cool if this game had a level editor like Excite Bike, but hey, maybe there's a sequel that can fix that for us. There were a lot of Spider-Man games for the Game Boy and Color, 6 to be exact, which I guess is why they called this one the Sinister Six, which was the only one I managed to enjoy, which is kind of surprising since this is a sequel to another game that I found to be really boring, but they were developed by different teams. And I remember being pretty blown away when I first played this game, maybe because I found myself actually enjoying a Spider-Man game on Game Boy, but I think also because of the animations, great music, and overall presentation. Spider-Man himself plays exactly how you'd hope he would, with crawling, swinging, and punching. The game's got 4 different difficulties though, so experiences may vary depending on what you choose. I for one can't speak on Nightmare difficulty because I've never played it, but chances are you'll probably be able to enjoy this straightforward and competent game on at least one of its difficulties. And honestly, all this game needed to be was straightforward and competent, an apparently unreachable bar for the previous 5 Game Boy Spider-Man titles. Spirou is some of BitManager's finest work. It is actually my second highest ranked BitManager's game. You might find out what number 1 is very soon. Like a lot of their games, this is based on a Belgian comic I know nothing about, but that really didn't matter as far as my enjoyment. This is perhaps my favorite Alberto Jose Gonzalez soundtrack, which is saying a lot, although it's extremely hard to actually choose one. So I'll have to compare this game's soundtrack with its Super Nintendo counterpart. This game's got pretty much the exact same strengths and weaknesses as all their other Belgian comics games. Great graphics and animations, but it has blind jumps and annoying ledges that are hard to grab onto, partly because they're visually misleading. Combine this with fall damage, but to be honest, the fall damage is not nearly as annoying as some of their other games, since you don't instantly die for falling 10 feet. The character animations result in this game feeling unresponsive. This guy has a gun weapon, but it feels like it takes forever for him to pull the thing out and actually shoot. Like a lot of their games, there's some levels where the real challenge is knowing what to do and where the heck to go, but this aspect of the game I found to be less irritating than what's in a lot of their other titles, which is why this game is a bit higher. The difficulty is pretty unbalanced as well. You'll go from challenging stages to really easy boss fights, but overall the game doesn't care about hurting your feelings. It's pretty challenging even on the lowest setting, checkpoints are scarce, but the game feeling satisfying to beat, while having one of the best soundtracks in the library was enough for me to put it this high up, despite any annoyances I may have had, that you almost certainly will also encounter if you choose to play. For me, the pros outweigh the cons here. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan is a game I've talked about too many times on the channel at this point, and it's on the opposite end of the spectrum from Konami's Motocross Maniacs we just saw, as instead of being simple looking but fast and smooth, the game is slow but has nice graphics. Kinda like Castlevania the Adventure, but unlike that game which is short and ball-bustingly difficult, Fall of the Foot Clan is short and honestly one of the easiest games in this video. Easily the easiest Konami 8-bit Turtles game ever made. So in other words, a good idea for a 1990 Game Boy release, and a great pick up and play title that you can finish in half an hour or less without much trouble. I don't mind this game's simplicity, but I will say the Turtles not playing any different from each other is always disappointing to see. The first Turtles game on NES got it right, well not really because Raphael is way better than the other three, but I mean at least it tried. TMNT 3 Radical Rescue on Game Boy did end up changing how the Turtles played from one another, but that game's got some problems for me. For one, I'm not the biggest Metroidvania guy, and two, 80% of my playtime was spent on the final boss rush, which is easily the hardest boss rush on Game Boy, no contest. And no, this is not just a me problem either. But yeah, I already talked about all these games in my TMNT the Cowabunga collection ranking video, which you can always check out, so I'm gonna move on now. Fall of the Foot Clan is short, simple fun that you can't really go wrong with as a Game Boy gamer, in my opinion. Also, I just watched a video of someone else playing this game and saw them throwing ninja stars, something I didn't even know was in the game, and I've beaten it multiple times. Prehistorik Man. This is without a doubt one of the best looking Game Boy games in my opinion, and you can come to that conclusion yourself without even diving into the game. All you have to do is stare at the title screen. European developers love to flex their technical prowess like this for the demo scenes of various PC games back in the day, and in this case programmer Elmar Krieger actually left a secret developer message in the game itself, claiming that the Amstrad CPC is like a Game Boy with a color screen and keyboard, which explains how he achieved all this. But now to get into the actual game. Some might call it mediocre, but I found it to be quite enjoyable. The boss fights in the game are pure spectacle, for better or for worse, because they can feel like a drag on repeat playthroughs, because, well, this game does have limited continues, which means it's not the easiest game, so you'll probably have to start from the beginning quite a few times. And the difficulty doesn't feel fully earned. There's definitely some what feels like BS deaths on your first attempts of levels. Things you just won't be able to see coming due to blind jumps, but trial and error BS is pretty standard for action platformers back then. Whether you'll be able to tolerate this depends on how much fun you're having, and for me, I was having fun alright. Mostly due to the graphics and music if I'm being honest, but I guess being a caveman and bonking things with the club is alright with me too. I guess it just awakens something primal in me. I did just hint at my favorite BitManager's game showing up soon, and that would in fact be Turok Rage Wars. This game's gameplay is pretty identical to Turok 3's, but it doesn't contain the same annoyances in the levels, which were objective-driven and maze-like. This is the closest a Turok game on the platform got to being a straight-up arcade-style run-and-gun, and also I have to come clean here. I was completely bamboozled by the titles of these games. As it turns out, Turok Rage Wars, which I assumed was the fourth Turok game for the system, is actually the third. I guess this is my fault for not being familiar with the N64 console counterparts of these games, but apparently Rage Wars on 64 emphasizes multiplayer, whereas on Game Boy it's single player. Yeah, I don't know. I guess the games were all named the same for marketing purposes, but if we're gonna be honest, this is the real Turok 3 on Game Boy. Maybe maybe not having a single player campaign from the original game to draw from is why this is so good. Levels are surprisingly varied, with different enemies and hazards on each, ranging from snowy windy areas to volcanic auto-scrolling lava-y areas. Though I think the auto-scrolling parts might be my least favorite thing about this game. It also tends to be my least favorite thing about 2D Mario games, so no surprise there. You also briefly transform into a lizard man, I think. I'm not sure what the deal is here. Maybe someone can teach me the lore in the comments. And you guys won't believe this, but that soundtrack by Alberto Jose Gonzalez is killer. This is unfortunately the last time we'll hear of him for my list, but if I had to pick the greatest Game Boy composer of all time, it might very well have to be him. Even if a Bit Manager's title sucked, you could always count on the music being great. Except Metal Masters, I guess, which is the worst fighting game on the platform, which is why it has no music during actual gameplay for some reason. Only on the title screen will you hear music, and it's the only reason this game is remembered at all. If that music did play during gameplay though, I probably have actually finished that god-awful game. Wendy every which way. I didn't know this character until I googled what she's from just now, and it turns out she's from Casper the Friendly Ghost. I apologize for not knowing the Casper lore so deeply. Anyway, this is a game that's pretty hard to hate unless you hate really easy games, because yeah, it's one of the easiest games in this whole video, and would definitely go in my short but fun Game Boy games you should playlist. Now this game here was made by WayForward, before they invented Shantae, during a time they were stuck in licensed game hell. But they had some of the less offensive licensed games on Game Boy Color. You get the impression they cared at least a little bit. This is the only one to make an appearance on my list though, because it's really just a solid game. With its wow factor coming from Wendy's gravity abilities, by holding up or down while jumping, you can swap gravity and walk on the ceiling. Think Metal Storm, but for babies. This makes for some fun and interesting level design, and a one-of-a-kind experience for the system. There's really nothing else that plays quite like it, which is why I can ignore the low challenge and music I don't really like, but at least the game looks quite nice. Also, the shooter levels are pretty bad here, but let's be honest, that's true for most platformers to throw these kinds of levels in, even for the likes of Ganbare Goemon Seikushi Dynamite's Arawaru. Wendy Every Which Way also has unique content only available if played on the GBA though, which is interesting, because I can't really think of any other Game Boy Color game that hides content on the Advance. I'm not sure how this benefited WayForward, or if Nintendo was for some reason involved and told them to, but I kinda wish those levels were just playable on Color, because I gotta come clean here guys. I don't actually own this game. Apparently the levels offer some actual challenge, with one-hit death too, so if someone's played these levels let me know how they are in the comments, and perhaps these levels would have elevated Wendy further up the list, but as it stands, it's right outside the top 112 for me. Sunsoft, legendary as they may be, were kind of known as the Looney Tunes guys on the Game Boy, which gave them a bit of a bad rap because most of these games were rubbish. While they developed the first Looney Tunes on Game Boy, which is really good, after that they handed development for the Looney Tunes IP over to Western Studios, and only acted as publisher. And if you know anything about Western Studios, you can imagine how that turned out. Daffy Duck Marvin Mission Sunsoft did develop though, but truthfully, I didn't like that game. But on Game Boy Color, we were blessed with a real Daffy Duck game, and you can immediately tell this was indeed Sunsoft. This might be the most beautifully animated Game Boy Color game. I mean, just look at that level clear screen. The animation frames also do not hurt the playability of this title, though you're mostly doing a lot of chucking dynamite at things, which itself doesn't have a throwing animation, it just flies out at you. But yeah, this game straight up feels like a slapstick cartoon on the Game Boy Color. It's kind of unbelievable. There's many different ways to die, and they all have unique and detailed animations. Kind of reminds me of Crash Bandicoot in this way, which is a funny comparison to make, seeing as Crash was originally inspired by Warner Bros. Looney Tunes cartoons. But basically, even dying in this game is kind of fun. As for the design itself, it is very weird and honestly confuses the hell out of me. It's a well-made game and all, I haven't played it in a while so I might get something wrong here, but the enemy encounters seem to be randomized on each new life, so if the enemy layout ends up being harder or feeling frustrating, it might just be due to bad RNG, so basically, skill is not all that important. Just get lucky next time. Also, there's an emphasis on finding treasures in this game. That's right, this game is a bit Wario-esque. The location of these treasure holes are also randomized. I don't think the treasure actually changes any outcome in this game though. There's only one ending, so it might only make your money count higher, though getting $20,000 grants you an extra life. The lives in this game are also weird, since they seem to function like Sonic's rings. You get hit, drop it, but you can pick it back up. So long as your hunger meter is above 0%, yes, they've put a hunger meter in a platformer, you're invincible. Well, not really, because you'll be falling into pits often, because there's some crazy knockback here. The knockback and pits are the main challenge here, but if that hunger meter goes down to 0, you will starve to death. So yeah, honestly everything about this game is weird, while the randomized enemy layouts could be seen as a legitimate flaw, because it does result in the level design being restricted and more simplistic as a result, I overall applaud them for making a truly unique, one-of-a-kind platformer for the system. While I also just called Wendy a one-of-a-kind game for the Game Boy, Daffy Duck Foul Play is a one-of-a-kind game in general, and I was glad to experience one last 8-bit Sunsoft gem before 8-bits and Sunsoft would disappear. Kid Icarus and Metroid share a lot of similarities. Of course, the original games share the same creators, but they were also only released in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, which had a player base of 4 million, which meant their reach was very limited there compared to the West, where both games released on the NES, which had a much larger player base. Both games would receive sequels on the Game Boy, but in the case of Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, this game came out only in the West, skipping Japan entirely. This game was developed by some of the same staff that worked on Metroid 2, alongside Tosei, who I think are definitely on a lower level than Nintendo. Tosei always made very nice looking games, but those games would often feature weird design choices or blatant design flaws. For me, the thing I hate the most about Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters is the inclusion of attack upgrades, which you get from finding sacred chambers. In the original Kid Icarus, this either matters less, or I just got lucky and found more of them, but in this game you don't really want to miss out on attack upgrades, because it will turn boss fights into a complete drag. I remember at one point counting how many hits it took to kill this boss, and I gave up after I got to 200. This is not challenging or engaging, it's just really boring. This is why I 100% prefer skill to matter more than how strong your character is in a game. And it's unfortunate that this happened because I didn't have the knowledge ahead of time of how important it is to actually acquire these upgrades. If you lose to the bosses back to the beginning of the labyrinth, which are definitely my least favorite levels in the Kid Icarus games, since it's not about action platforming challenges really, it's all about knowing where the heck you need to go. But anyway, I think this is definitely a worthy sequel to the original Kid Icarus. The final level of the original game is highly questionable in my opinion, and the one in this game is so much better. The flying is also much improved, but I overall still prefer the first game, due to those design annoyances I mentioned. The core gameplay here though is very much Kid Icarus, and by that I mean good. It's a shame that this would be the last platformer in the series, since I would love to see more in this style. Probably will never happen though, and it would be 21 years until the next Kid Icarus game, with Sakurai deciding to make one of the finest 3DS games of all time. It wasn't a platformer though, only a really good third-person action-adventure rail shooter hybrid, and at this point I will kindly accept anything Kid Icarus related. It's a real shame it's already been 14 years. Well, would you look at what we have here? It's good old Bubble Bobble, and I don't know what it is, but I actually prefer this version of the game to the NES version, because being on Game Boy, it doesn't lock you out of the true ending if you don't have a second person to play with. Something I really appreciate, as someone with no friends, and especially no friends that like old-ass 8-bit video games. At least that's just how I've heard you get the true ending of Bubble Bobble NES. I don't actually know, but you know what? I won't ever need to know, because I can just boot up Bubble Bobble for the Game Boy instead. But really, if you're a diehard, I suppose the NES version is probably preferable, seeing as the entire level screen is visible at all times. In this version you hardly have any visibility below you, which can get really annoying. But I prefer this game greatly over classic Bubble Bobble, which is actually an original game, but it plays pretty poorly, and you somehow have even less room to see below you. This kinda makes sense given that this one wasn't developed by Taito, but was in fact developed by the same creators as the Sexy Beach trilogy. That's just what I've heard anyway. Someone in the comments will have to confirm whether this is true or not. Genjin Kotts is one of those games you either love or you hate, which I made up just now, because I don't actually know a single other person on the planet who likes this game, except one guy who rated it a 7 out of 10, not bad. He said this game has very responsive controls, and I completely agree. It might have the best controls of any platformer in the entire library. You're even able to drop down from platforms in this game. The action platform levels are very fun, albeit hard. This is like Ghosts and Goblins, in that you die in 2 hits, but unlike that game, in this you actually lose your weapon if you take damage, and you still don't get it back after you respawn. This is a huge disadvantage, as all you have is your fist, which doesn't have a lot of range. Combine this with limited continues, and I'd honestly say that this game is probably harder than Ghosts and Goblins, but it does reward mastery, so it is fun to go through again and again to try and get a bit further. But now I have to address what's stupid about this game. Well, this game is actually an adaptation of a Japanese caveman drum toy. I have no idea how this even got a game adaptation, to be honest, because the most viewed video on YouTube for it has only 35,000 views, but I suppose I can assume it was kind of popular once upon a time. But just compare it with the most viewed Furby videos, which was a toy that, as we all know, was eventually adapted into the Japanese exclusive Game Boy Color rhythm game, Dancing Furby. But anyway, the level music in Genjin Kotts has been made to imitate the sounds of the toy, which made the soundtrack not good. Which is really unfortunate, because this game actually shares the same composer as Sumo Fighter, which is a great soundtrack, and that alone honestly probably put Sumo Fighter many spots higher than it maybe deserves to be on this list. But yeah, the composer wasn't allowed to make a great soundtrack for this game. What else sucks are these water levels. The water level controls are not good, but also I have no idea how you're supposed to avoid damage at points, because the spike hitboxes are enormous. And last but not least, we have these memory-based rhythm mini-games between worlds that go all the way up to a 15-hit pattern by the end of the game, and if you fail this you get sent back to the previous level. This actually might be the hardest aspect of the game, which I think is quite stupid, but I suppose you can write it down or record it and play it back to make it a bit easier. That's about all I have to say about this caveman platformer with many pros and cons. You can also check out my top 10 caveman platformers on Game Boy video, where it ranked 3rd. Fortified Zone is the first game of the Ikari no Yosai series, and I'm not gonna lie, I used to think this was a part of the Ikari Warrior series, because they're both running guns, and both have Ikari in the title. But no, it turns out that just means anger, and well, this series was developed by Jalico, not SNK, as the levels here are pretty much mazes, and you'll have to use the pause screen map to navigate them, as well as search for the keys to progress further. You can switch between a male and female character. The male character has a second weapon at his disposal, which makes him the best for dishing out damage, while the female character has no secondary weapon, but has a jump and faster movement that makes her preferable for navigating levels and avoiding enemy attacks. What's also cool is that if one character falls, you can still continue playing with the other character until they also die. This is a very cool game for the Game Boy, seeing as there weren't many running guns, especially top-down ones, though the thing I like most about this game is probably the killer soundtrack, but I like the sequel soundtrack even more, which may even be the main reason I put it higher up on the list. I can't help but feel like the characters move a bit slow for a game, with big levels that you'll need to backtrack through, and I've said it many times before in this video, but I do prefer a straightforward action design, though honestly for a Game Boy game this works quite well. They probably didn't want to bombard you with too much action on this thing. This was a 1991 game, so before the Super Game Boy, and as a result they substituted some of that action-based difficulty with, well, knowing how to navigate through levels. It looks like that limitation-driven design carried forward into the Super Nintendo entry I haven't played yet, seeing as it says search and destroy on the cover, so this is kinda like how Metal Gear's stealth gameplay began as a workaround for MSX limitations, eventually evolving into its core design philosophy, though Ikari no Yosai ended with its Super Nintendo release instead of continuing for decades. I also didn't know that this game includes special passwords to make the female character chibified, which is only possible in the Japanese release, so that seems to be the definitive version of the game. She even shoots out hearts! Don't make the same mistake as me by playing the one called Fortified Zone. Revelations the Demon Slayer, known as Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible in Japan, originally released on the Game Boy in 1992, really surprised me as someone who absolutely does not claim to be much of an RPG guy. But wow, I really enjoyed this one. First of all, the music is amazing. I do think this series has the best RPG music on Game Boy, and well, some of the best music on Game Boy period, especially that battle music, but all of it is good. The OST being great in RPGs definitely does a lot to alleviate RPG fatigue for me, if I just never get tired of hearing the music. In fact, it might make me more inclined to keep playing. I thought I remembered the soundtrack being small or limited though, but actually it's about the same length as Dragon Warrior Monsters 1 and 2, which are much longer games. And that's the other thing, this game actually respects your time. I beat it in one sitting on my first playthrough, something I very rarely do for my first playthrough of a turn-based RPG. The only other ones really coming to mind right now are Azure Dreams and Dragon Quest I, but unlike those games I enjoyed myself all the way through with this one, jamming to those tunes. The encounter rate isn't exactly low, but I thought the combat being so fast more than makes up for it. Just like other titles in the series, you can summon demons, up to 100 in this game, and you can recruit them by successfully passing their interviews. Just like in Devil Children by the same developer, demons in this game do not level up, so you'll need to recruit stronger ones as you go along, or fuse the ones you already have to create more powerful demons. But yeah, you end up having 6 party members to use per turn, and apparently the game's also got a Pokemon-style Game Link battle mode, which as you might suspect I've never used, and good luck finding someone who will actually do this with you. Now you might have noticed I haven't talked about the plot, and well, that's because I don't remember it. Fighting game conversions on the Game Boy often didn't turn out so great. Not because they couldn't have worked, but because publishers were more likely to outsource development to lesser studios. See Street Fighter 2 with Sun L, or any of the 4 Mortal Kombat games, except the second one, which actually ain't too bad. But Killer Instinct, just like Donkey Kong Land and Battletoads, was developed by none other than Rare themselves, so it turned out pretty much as good as you could hope for on the Game Boy. And actually this was the first Killer Instinct game I ever played, so I really had no idea what I was doing. So at the time I probably appreciated the more simplified gameplay, without even knowing it, as not all special moves made the cut, and there's only 2 buttons to work with here. So you have to use different strikes by the direction you press and how long you hold the button for, which I thought was surprisingly intuitive. Cinder and Riptor have also sadly been cut, but overall it's hard to go wrong with a Game Boy game that looks, sounds, and plays this great, as expected of Rare, with their 3D pre-rendered graphics and great composers. In the credits you'll see this game was actually developed by 5 people, with just 1 programmer. So yeah, 60% of the team for this one worked on those graphics and fluid animations. I wish Street Fighter 2 could have got the same treatment, but instead, we're left with our 5 frames per second experience. Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that Sun L mysteriously disappeared shortly after this one, and funnily enough this conversion was released the same year as Killer Instinct. I suspect I may have some explaining to do with this one, since I feel like this is a game you frequently see ranked in people's top 10s or even top 5s. And I do mean regular old people, not just Watch Mojo and IGN. but it's also true that Metroid is a very popular series, at least out here in the West. And it's also true that the average person hasn't actually played or finished that many Game Boy games. I only finished about 20 or 30 or so, before I decided to finish over 500 because I can't help myself, I guess, I don't know actually. But basically, if Metroid 2 was one of those 20 or 30 games, it'd probably be pretty close to the top 10. This is an extremely important game in the Metroid series, as it takes place directly before Super Metroid, a game so legendary it pretty much became responsible for an entire genre. But truthfully, Metroid 2 here is my least favorite 2D Metroid game, and I've played all of them except Dread, because I forget modern video games exist most of the time. The core gameplay is an obvious upgrade from Metroid 1, featuring two weapons new to the series, the laser beam and the plasma beam, the space jump which allows you to jump indefinitely in the air, the ability to crouch and shoot downwards during jumps, the morph ball also lets you climb all the way up to ceilings, and the spring jump which lets you jump while you're in the morph ball form. Samus in general feels a lot more responsive to control here than in the first game too, and the graphics can definitely be seen as an improvement, but unfortunately they're all green or monochrome or potentially many other colors depending on what you choose to play this on, which is my first problem with the game. It's pretty hard to know where you are when not only is there not a map which this game would have greatly benefited from, but also everything is the same color, so everything just kind of blends together for me, which is not ideal for a Metroidvania maze game. I don't know if this adds to the repetitive nature of the game, but yeah, that's the other thing. I find this game to be highly repetitive, since the goal is to go around and kill 47 Metroids, which is not even a problem unique to this game, since I also found the remake on 3DS to be quite repetitive as well. But this one's got colors and a map though, so I personally prefer this version. Apparently there's also a fan game that everyone seems to think is the best of the three, but you won't ever find me participating in illegal activities. But yeah, going around similar looking areas, killing 47 of the same or very similar creatures, does get old to me, especially when I don't find it very satisfying to kill them. Despite the gameplay upgrades, I'd much rather replay Metroid 1, which has just 3 guys to satisfyingly kill. But that's just me. I also do like the music in that game a lot more atmosphere-wise. This game certainly doesn't have bad music. Some of it's quite good, like the one I chose to play in the background, but a lot of times this game's completely silent or simply has spooky space noises playing, which is too bad because typically Metroid has great music. It ends up being one of the biggest highlights of the game. A lot of the music that's here I'm not sure does much to elevate the atmosphere, to make me more interested and invested in killing 47 poor little guys. All that being said, this game's still pretty good and worth checking out. That's why it's in this video after all, especially because there's nothing else in the entire library like it. RoboCop. Now this game may have one of the most iconic title themes of all time, composed by Jonathan Dunn, which you're hearing right now. You may have also heard it in a washing machine ad, mixtape, or Dilbert animation. And yeah, it is amazingly beautiful for a title screen theme, and also surprisingly long. This has to be one of the longest Game Boy music tracks before looping. This game was originally released on the Amstrad CPC, MSX, and C64 in 1988. And like I said, European devs really like to wow you right at the title screen, and they did so here with the music. But it's the Game Boy music that's perhaps the most well known in particular, due to appearing in the popular Ariston commercial, which was chosen because an advertising executive heard the music when his son was playing the game on his Game Boy. And well, he must have thought it was really freaking good, because he contacted Ocean and they let him use it for free. But besides the title screen music, I also just think this game's really good, which is surprising because it's an Ocean game. They released a lot of Game Boy games, but only 2 of them appear on my list, both run and guns. However, the game was originally worked on in conjunction with Data East, who handled the arcade version, so it's not surprising the core gameplay here is good, because Data East actually knew what they were doing. While my favorite thing about this game is an Ocean Original Edition, the title music, my least favorite thing is also an Ocean Edition that did not exist in the arcade version. This absolutely stupid face puzzle, which has a 40-second time limit that if you fail, you get sent back to the beginning of the level. Why would they put this in a monochrome game, where you can hardly differentiate the different face parts? Actually, I looked at another one of Ocean's versions of this game, and they made everything the same color in that, so never mind I guess. But anyway, this is why I felt no remorse for throwing some shade at Ocean earlier, because this is the exact type of baffling design choices they like to put in their games. This puzzle here resulted in 50% or more of my total playtime being spent on this single level, which is the second level of the game, which you might be able to guess isn't the hardest. It's just the puzzle part right here that will force you to replay the level over and over. Luckily the game has unlimited continues, but I prefer the challenge in this game came from the actually fun run and gun and beat 'em up gameplay, which was something Data East understood for their arcade release. But yeah, I've hardly touched on the actual gameplay yet, because I don't really have any problems with it. It plays slow, but that's exactly what you'd expect for RoboCop, and it actually gives a kind of methodical feel to the game. It's good fun, which is something the 3 other RoboCop games on Game Boy completely failed at in my opinion. The only other one I bothered to finish was RoboCop vs. the Terminator, but I certainly don't recommend doing so yourself. It just got a little personal for me with that one. Interestingly, RoboCop Game Boy Color doesn't even seem to have footage of a human being clearing the game. All I could find was a tool assist run, where they just turned RoboCop into Missing Note the entire time. Shippu Iron Leaguer is the last of the Sun L original titles. We will see them one more time for a conversion of theirs, assuming I'm still alive by the time I finish that video, but this game comes from the minds of Sun L, at least as much as possible, for a game based on the mecha sports anime from Sunrise of the same name. Do you guys know anything about this one? Well, I don't. But it made for a cool game because you get to control so many different mecha dudes from the show that all have unique abilities based on the league that they're in. This includes baseball, soccer, karate, American football, kendo, basketball, and hockey. So 7 playable characters you can switch between on the fly for whatever situation they're most useful in, which adds for a lot of variety in a pretty short 1 hour duration Game Boy game. And of course on subsequent playthroughs, it'd be even shorter than that. For a game I thought was this cool, I was surprised, well not that surprised, that there's very little coverage of it. I sorted by popularity, and there's just a few videos of this game reaching more than 1k views, so I'm hoping to put at least a few more people onto it. While it looks and sounds nice, the gameplay still has that Sun L unpolished awkwardness to it, with its enemy placement, screen view, and hit detection. This didn't annoy me much, seeing as I can just switch to a different character and get a fresh new health bar, but there are a couple parts where that advantage doesn't matter that I found to be annoying. Like the soccer section that's still relatively inoffensive, but you'll no doubt probably get a little annoyed yourself with the hit detection, enemy speed, and lack of screen view below you. And yeah, you do end up having to play some of the sports in this game, but most annoyingly was this trial and error auto-scroll section, where you're on a platform and just have to guess what path to take, basically. Not ideal for being the biggest challenge in the game, at least on your first playthrough. Kinda reminds me of Robocop, which we just talked about, but this game is still absolutely worth checking out for Game Boy gamers for its neat concept and badass tunes. Wizards and Warriors: The Fortress of Fear is one that's kind of hard to recommend. Fun fact, by the way, this was the first Western-developed Game Boy game, released in January 1990, so quite early in the library. It's also part of the Wizards and Warriors series, which had a legendary trilogy on the NES that I must admit I haven't played yet, so I didn't go into this game with any expectations, other than this game might be good since Rare makes good games sometimes. But they're also known for making real hard games sometimes, and this game definitely earns the name Fortress of Fear, because the first time you play this game, you'll probably get destroyed and get too scared to want to try again. Because beating this game is indeed earned, and that's where the enjoyment comes from. I've actually seen this game referred to as the Dark Souls of the library. I'm not sure why, I guess it's because both games have knights in them, I guess. But anyways, this game made me feel like a warrior when I beat it. Mainly what makes this game difficult are the quirks such as fall damage, having pretty much no invincibility, and no continues. My strat pretty much was play through and die as little as possible in the early levels, so I can enter the final levels and bosses with tons of lives, which allows me to tank hits. The boss fights themselves are super jank. Kinda feels like these bosses got the least attention during development time. I'm also fairly certain that a no damage run in this game is impossible, but you'll be able to find a few no death runs. Most of all, I just found myself liking the unique gameplay of this one. There's not a lot of games, on Game Boy anyway, that let you attack and move while crouching. You can also swing your sword upwards. I just found it fun to try and safely poke my way through this game. There's also chests you can open with the keys you find, and there's also a nice soundtrack from David Wise. Who could have guessed that a guy like him could produce quality music? Sagaia is the Game Boy version of a little game called Darius, and Darius, as you may have heard, is one of the big boys in the shmup landscape. In the arcades, it's known for its 3-screen panoramic display, which you might be able to guess was not able to be recreated for the Game Boy release. So it ends up looking like a more regular shmup, only with a lot of sea creatures to destroy, which is another thing this series is known for. And I'm actually showing only footage from the boss rush at the end of the game because it's pretty much the only thing I remember from this game, since it's where I spent at least 50% of my total playtime. Yeah, having to redo this without many power-ups is rough, and makes for one of the hardest boss rushes on Game Boy, though it's not even close to being the hardest, which I would definitely say is TMNT 3. This boss rush doesn't appear in the arcade games, and I'm pretty sure is unique only to this version. Luckily the game has infinite continues, otherwise it might very well be the hardest shmup on the system just to beat. There's also respawns rather than checkpoints to make it more manageable, but I remember on the same day after I beat this game, I went to a nearby Smash Bros tournament to pick up a VR headset for my friend, and I didn't feel like entering because I hadn't played or entered in 3 years. But the #1 Melee player in my state paid for my entry, and I ended up beating him in the bracket Game 5 last hit, but I have to say, I was much more elated after beating Sagaia for the Game Boy, and I still consider it my biggest gaming accomplishment on that day.